Hey, this is Bill. This week we have an unreleased episode from October when Jeremy and I were just trying to figure out how to do this podcasting thing, and we discuss discipleship. Some of the audio quality's not as good as it should be, but we hope you'll understand. Next week we'll be back with Tesha Mallory to discuss the Holy Spirit. Hope you enjoy. Hi, I'm Bill Sardin.
And I'm Jeremy Pressgrove. And this is the
Happy Hippie Jesus Show. We're never going to get that right, are we?
Oh, never.
No. That's all right. This episode, we're going to be talking about discipleship and whether Jesus really intended everyone to be a disciple. This isn't really intended to be like definitive theology, but more what our Jewish brothers and sisters would have called midrash, where we're kind of working through all of this and kind of learning through discussion.
Yeah. Hopefully,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So where do you want to start today, Bill?
I say we start with the Great Commission, because that's where Jesus gives the command to go out and make disciples. In fact, the Great Commission, it comes from Matthew 28:16 through 20, and it reads like this. Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, because there were 11 because Judas was bad and was gone now, to the mountain.
He kind of died.
Yes. Yeah, he did.
Yeah.
To the mountain where Jesus told them to go. But, even if he hadn't have died, I think he would have been left out of this.
You think so?
Yeah, I think so. Well, anyway, back to the scripture. Now, the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus told them to go. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. Jesus came near and spoke to them. I've received all authority in heaven and on earth. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey everything that I've commanded you. Look, I myself will be with you every day until the end of the present age. So Jesus starts out here telling his disciples to go out and make disciples, right?
Yeah.
But my question is, did he actually intend for every Christian to be a disciple? And to get at that, I think maybe it might be a good idea to talk a little bit about what a first century disciple was.
Okay.
Yeah. So what's your understanding of a first century disciple? I mean, what is their role? How would you define that?
So, man, that's an interesting question. It probably doesn't mean exactly what it means to us today, but that's okay. I tell people all the time, the Bible's not left clean in place in 21st century America, but there's other ways to get that. So those disciples, or there was a group of disciples, and they were kind of followers. In the first century, you would have a rabbi or a teacher, and then they would have a group of kind of students who followed them and learned from them, and one would eventually replace them. So that's kind of where I would start with how they would have understood kind of first century discipleship, and it would have been in the context of this rabbi-student relationship. Yeah, what would you say, Bill?
In fact, that's exactly what I was going to say, that rabbis went looking for potential students that had the qualities that they saw to be able to carry on their teachings and eventually replace them as the rabbi. Rabbis had what was called a yoke, and you might remember Jesus saying at one time, my yoke is easy. Mm-hmm. And that's not something you put on an oxen. It's actually the teaching. It's everything from how the rabbi understood God, how the rabbi understood Scripture, how the rabbi thought Scripture and God called them to live, and just their overall philosophy. And then a disciple that went on to take the rabbi's place after the rabbi had passed on would then expand on that teaching.
Yeah. And they would take their own students and eventually, and we see some of that in first century Christianity. First, second, and third John, they use the plural we, throughout the writings. We are writing you, we are writing you, we are writing you. So I think most scholars would argue that these are John's disciples of the Apostle John, and they're carrying on his teachings in a letter form, and that's why they're using a plural we.
Right.
They're not attempting to be devious. It's just that's how they understood discipleship. We carry on the legacy of John. So we see some of that in the first century, and I would say you probably see some attempts at that in Paul and his journeys with like a Timothy or a Titus or someone like that. Paul wasn't the best rabbi, and he kind of got cross with his disciples sometimes.
Yes, he did. Yeah, he did. But we know that Paul had those very same type of disciples because we've got letters from Paul that we think weren't necessarily from Paul, because in the first and second century, it was not uncommon for a great teacher like Paul to have disciples that later on would write in that teacher's name.
Yeah.
And we've got a few of the letters in Scripture that we think were possibly written by one of Paul's disciples after Paul had passed on, because they talk about things that didn't exist when Paul was around, like bishops and things like that.
Yeah, and I think it's important to these groups aren't being dishonest. That's how the first century worked, and you would write in your teacher's name, and that was your way of both paying honor to your teacher and kind of stating, the yoke has been passed to me, and I'm now trusted by this teacher to carry on.
I mean, I know it's a strange a strange comparison, but it's a lot like comic books. You don't have the same writers writing these characters in these comic books, but they're all part of the comic book canon, and they're all accepted as that character.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So basically, disciples were comic book writers, is what we've just said, right?
Yeah, I'm going to regret that later.
Okay, they weren't comic book writers, but you get the example.
Yeah, but that's a way to understand them, yes.
Right.
So,
or at least that tradition of writing in the name of your teacher.
Yeah. And so in the first century, a disciple would have been like handpicked by, so I guess, kind of what we're saying in the first century, a disciple would have been handpicked by the teacher, by, Jesus in the case of his 12 disciples, or, John's disciples who probably write 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, or Paul's disciples who write some of his letters.
Exactly.
So they're handpicked, and they're a relatively small number that this teacher chooses to invest everything he has in. It's more the akin of a small group, and these people would have followed the teacher, would have eaten with the teacher, would have been present with the teacher, and then would have been trusted with that teacher's legacy.
Yeah, you might even want to say it's a lot like students in a small seminary that take multiple classes under one professor and start carrying on that professor's philosophy about, or that professor's theology.
Maybe a doctoral advisor would be a better analogy.
Oh, maybe.
If you went on to get your doctor, a PhD or something like that, your advisor who would then make you the protege.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So I say that kind of brings us back around to your question. Jesus gives the Great Commission to 11 disciples, and he tells them to, make disciples, and then they'll make disciples kind of to the ends of the earth. So what did that mean to that first group to hear it?
It almost sounds like Jesus is saying, go out and do exactly what I did with you.
Mm-hmm.
And so on and so on. But don't just limit it to the borders of Judah or Israel. But my question is did everybody that even Jesus brought salvation to in the Scriptures fit the description that we just talked about?
I don't think so. I think there's numerous examples of people being healed but not being taken under Jesus' wing in the same way that, his disciples were. He has a relatively small core group that seem to be following him around and seem to be present, and he seems to invest more heavily in. And I think we see that repeatedly throughout the scriptures, both in the healings and in the way that he teaches. Often he'll teach like a mass group in like a parable, and then he kind of pulls his group aside and will explain to them something in more depth. And that more depth of that increased pouring into is different than how he treats everyone.
Okay. Yeah. So does that mean these others are not disciples as well?
I guess that depends on how we want to define disciple.
Right. The demon-possessed man in the Gerasenes. And this is a great example. And Jesus goes across the Galilee. He's in Gentile regions. He comes across this man possessed by a demon, and he's chained up. He's cutting himself. He breaks free of the chains all the time. He lives in a cemetery, and Jesus casts the demons out of him. And all the people around are amazed, and they're scared to death, and they tell Jesus to leave. They're probably ticked off because he threw the demons into the pigs that they were raising, and there went their food supply into the sea. But afterwards, the man that he's cast the demons out of turns to Jesus and said, "Let me go with you." And Jesus says, "No, you need to go back to your people and let them see what God has done for you." He literally says, "Let me follow you," and Jesus says no.
Yeah.
And so you might even say that maybe he's not so much a disciple in the definition that we gave just a little bit ago, but more of what we would call today a witness.
Yeah. So why don't you, I guess that's in Mark 5, and the verses you're talking about specifically are like 18 and 19. Jesus is getting into the boat, and the man possessed by the demons begged him that he might be with him. And Jesus refused and said, "Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and what mercy he has shown you." And then it said he went away and he began to kind of proclaim how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone was amazed.
Yeah, because he's not going to carry on Jesus' teachings. He's not going to go carry on what he has learned or even Jesus' way of life. He's going to give a witness to God's mercy and God's healing power.
And that's certainly different than the role that the 12 disciples played. It's a different role. Yeah.
Did he receive salvation or did he not receive salvation?
He certainly seems to have received like salvation and healing.
Okay.
That's how I would read the story.
Right. That's the way I read it as well. That's the way I read it as well. I'm just trying to further this discussion on whether or not he was actually a disciple, and are all people who receive salvation disciples? I mean, my thought is are we trying to hit a home run with everybody when a lot of times the proper thing is to bunt or get a base hit? Or even a sacrifice fly.
Yeah. I certainly think we've expanded the idea of discipleship over the last 2,000 years. That when you say disciple to a modern Christian living in the U.S., it means something different to us now than it meant in the first century.
What do you think?
I think that's okay.
What does it mean then in the U.S.? Because we have this problem in the church, I think, is we talk about we're United Methodist, and we're in the Arkansas Conference, and our mission statement for our conference is disciples who make disciples for the transformation of the world. But we never talk about what a disciple is.
I think, now this is not like what the bishop would say or what, our district strategy teams or whoever would say. I think in 21st century America, most people would use the word disciple and Christian interchangeably. That to be a Christian is to be a disciple on some levels. And if we take And in the first century, in like these followings of Jesus, there were different groups. There were the 12 named disciples. And then there was this other kind of group that really seemed to follow him pretty closely. I would put like Mary, Martha, Lazarus. There's this other smaller group that seems to be following him closely and seems to be kind of involved in his life and intimate. And they seem to have a lot of discipleship characteristics. And then there's, these mass groups that he's teaching and he's interacting with. And there's people that he might heal that'll kind of proclaim or be a witness to the healing or the transformation that's taken place. But they're not receiving the investment of Jesus' time and energy that top group is. So they were different, not different levels in some had salvation or different levels in some were more loved or, none of any of those things, just there was a different amount of time and energy that Jesus invested into these different groups, and all groups seem to have a different level of understanding of what that meant. And I think in a lot of ways, our churches are set up like that right now. We call everyone a disciple, or we say we want everyone to be a disciple, but we have, this huge group that kind of comes on Sundays. And they have, like faith, and they would profess, a Christian belief in the mass group, but they're not doing a lot beyond like Sunday morning. And then we'll have another group that might, come to some like events or things like that, or they might volunteer in some different missions or things in our community. And they seem to be kind of growing in their faith. And then we have this other group who are kind of the leaders of your church, who are involved in other things, and they're leading small groups or teaching, or, they're doing other things, and they're kind of filling that same role.
Okay. Yeah. So that Sunday morning group, that's a big group.
Yeah.
That's a big group. And I would argue that would be probably the same people. And I don't mean this in any kind of disparaging way. It's just a biblical comparison, as the 5,000 who come into the wilderness and they're fed.
I mean, it's smaller than that in my church on Sunday, but yes.
Right. But I'm talking about church in the big C, the everybody together. So they're not there to further the teaching, but to receive the teaching and the feeding. And honestly, if we go to Paul lays out this process of spiritual maturity.
Sure.
Or maturation. So,
yeah.
And for a lot of people, that's their starting place. And some people, that's their ending place too.
Yeah.
But as you spiritually mature, you can move into different aspects of discipleship.
Yes.
Yes.
And we see that throughout as well. John is one of Jesus's disciples, and then John graduates and has his own disciples. And then it seems that his disciples have graduated to the point where they feel comfortable writing on his behalf, and they're kind of carrying on his teachings.
Right.
So we see this kind of progression or maturity through like people, and that's a natural step for us.
Jeremy, I love love. How about you?
I love love too, I guess.
Valentine's Day's coming up real soon. What are you going to give your love?
I know. I'll give her the perfect gift. I'll give her the opportunity to discover the Happy Hippie Jesus Show so she can love it like I love it. And the best way to do that is to rate it and write a review on iTunes. That way everyone can discover and love the show just like me.
Man, you're just like Cupid. Now back to the show.
So like the woman at the well in John.
Okay.
She comes to draw water early in the morning. Nobody. She's kind of an outcast in her town because that's why she's drawing water at midday instead of early in the morning. Because she's been married several times and buried several times, and now she's living with somebody who's not her husband. And I'm not going to judge her because that could be her brother. Although the way it's worded, it's probably not.
Yes.
So she comes and Jesus talks to her a little bit and tells her, asks her for some water. She draws him some water. They have a theological discussion, and he tells her that if she knew who he was, she'd ask him for living water, and that leads to further theological discussion. And it also leads to a debate. She's a Samaritan, and she wants to know who's right about where to worship. The Jews who worship in one place, and the Samaritans who worship on another mountain. And Jesus kind of, in a sly way, lets them know that neither one of them are right. To me, she represents the beginning worshiper, somebody just coming in, somebody that is worshiping but hasn't moved to that discipleship stage yet. And but she does have that excitement of that new worshiper too, because she runs into town and tells everybody, "You got to hear what this guy told me."
Yeah. And I think, that's both okay. And I think on some levels, 21st century Americans, we would consider that like discipleship on some levels. If you're telling other people about what you're hearing and inviting other people to come and participate in the worship experience, then that's a step forward, I think.
Yeah, she's the member of the church that goes and says, "I want you to come to church with me." She just started church, loves it, and wants everybody to come with her.
Yeah. Definitely.
I want to jump towards a little bit further in the story. After Jesus has been crucified, after his resurrection, and even into his ascension into heaven, and into Acts. And a lot of people don't realize this. Acts is the Gospel of Luke, the sequel. Same author. This is his sequel here. And in Acts 6, the disciples are now called the apostles. They're apostles because they witnessed the resurrection of Jesus.
Yes.
They've run into this problem. The Greek members of the congregation aren't receiving their fair share of the food, and they're coming to the apostles to complain. And instead of having time to preach and teach and heal and do the things that as disciples they needed to do to carry on Jesus' ministry, they were busy waiting tables, so to say. They were busy making sure that everybody got their fair share. They were settling disputes.
Yes.
And so what they do now is they elect a group to now be the servants within that community, to handle those disputes, and to make sure the food is distributed evenly. And this is where we get the phrase deacons. They were the deacons of the church. And
Stephen is the one out of that group that everybody's heard of.
Right, yeah. And he's the first Christian martyr. That's why he's so famous.
Yes.
So and I'm cautious to say this because I don't want to offend our brothers and sisters who are deacons in our denomination, because that is an ordained order. It is completely different than what's going on right here in what we're talking about at the moment. They were set up, these particular deacons were set up to handle the disputes and to distribute food. And the disciples, who are now apostles, feel like that's not their job. So that's my question. So are they not disciples?
Well, let me ask you this. I don't think Stephen got himself into trouble to the point he was stoned by just distributing food.
Oh, I know this. Remember, we're practicing midrash here.
Yeah. I mean, Stephen seems to, that might have been his original role as a distributor of food, but he seems to move beyond that.
Right.
In the story of Acts, he moves beyond it fairly quickly. Who knows, how long that actually took, or what happened. But so Stephen, I guess this would be my take on what we see in Stephen's life from how it's lived out in Acts. He's coming in and he's a part of this new community. and he's learning, and he's, participating in some ways, and he does things to set himself apart. He might volunteer additionally, or, do some different things to make, himself known. And he's a person of integrity that's respected in that community. So they elect him as this leader, or to fill this deacon role. And it seems that he continues to grow from there. And perhaps it seems that maybe part of that role as a deacon, as he gets some time, or the disciples invest in him more heavily, and he appears to fairly quickly be teaching on his own and interacting with religious leaders on his own. And that's how he gets himself in trouble with the local authorities. And he launches quite the sermon before he gets stoned.
Yes, he does.
He lets them all know and lays out his kind of form. So maybe like Stephen is a good example of the progression of a disciple.
He is. Yeah, you're absolutely right. He is. As we've been talking about this today and discussing it, I can't help but think Paul writing to the Corinthians and discussing different spiritual gifts.
Sure.
Corinthians 12, he lays out all these different spiritual gifts and starts talking about the parts of the body.
Uh-huh.
Every part of the body has its own function. I mean, you don't smell with your fingertips. You don't talk with your ears. Everything has its role. And I think as Christianity developed and moved on, because what we see a lot in Acts and even in the letters of Paul is they're trying to figure out how to do this Christianity thing. It's brand new to them. And with that, the idea of being a disciple evolves as well, beyond the traditional role of a disciple that we described at the beginning of the episode today. That it became more about what individual part can you do to expand the kingdom of God.
Yeah. So I guess to tie it back in, what we're saying, by the definition of a disciple at the end of the first century, it would have been kind of that whole bigger group that was following Jesus, that, the people that were providing meals for him, or the people that were letting him stay at their house, or, all these different people that were filling different roles, but weren't necessarily ever going to preach or teach or fill the role of the group that becomes the apostles. They all would have been considered disciples.
Yeah, I mean, even the worshiper fills an important role in discipleship. That is what we are created to do. Is we're created to reflect the image of God and worship God. So you might even argue the worshiper is the ultimate goal of discipleship, and everything else is to bring people to be worshipers. Does that make sense?
You could say a little bit more.
Okay, so you can go and witness to someone and tell them about the love of Jesus Christ, and if they're not eating, I've always said, you can go tell a hungry person about Jesus all day long, and what they want is a sandwich.
Yeah.
And that sandwich to them is Jesus. So you are doing the role of a disciple in feeding the hungry.
Yes.
But where we're going to bring that person eventually is to worship God. That is what we are created to do. And all the things that Jesus does throughout his ministry, whether it's eating with the sinners and tax collectors who have been pushed out because here we are, we've got this country that has been invaded and occupied by a foreign nation, and the religious, the good religious people have said to themselves, why did this happen to us? Obviously, there are people who are unclean and sinning greatly among us. these are the people that Jesus is eating with. The ones that the Pharisees, the Sadducees, have thought these are those sinners. They're the ones that have caused us to be in the situation we're in, that have brought God's judgment down on us. And so they're not welcome in worship. But as Jesus eats and drinks with them, he's inviting them into worship. Because that's what we're created to do, is to worship our Creator. In fact, if you don't like worshiping, heaven's going to be a real big disappointment for you, because that's pretty much all we're going to do is worship. I just think the worship band's going to be better than the ones that we experience here.
Man, your worship leader doesn't hear that.
Oh no, my worship leader is awesome. But they're not a heavenly choir. I mean, nobody is. Yeah. So, might get myself in trouble on that. Lauren, you're awesome. You sound great. You're doing a wonderful job.
Don't worry. Lauren's never going to hear that. He's not going to listen to her podcast. No.
Even the people that Jesus feeds out in the wilderness, he's bringing them to worship. Jesus is constantly bringing people towards worship. The ultimate duty of a disciple is to worship, but we bring others to worship along with us.
Okay.
Now, does that make sense?
Are we making disciples then?
Hopefully.
In our churches.
Hopefully. That's the thing is do we always know when people are worshiping as well? I can go into a worship service and sing my heart out. I can raise my hands. But if I'm not feeling it and I am not connecting with God, am I worshiping in that moment?
Yes.
Yes?
I think so.
You're going with the old John Wesley, fake it till you make it?
Me. You got to start somewhere.
You do have to start somewhere.
And I don't know. I think we put too much of an emphasis on, I wasn't feeling it, or I'm not feeling it, or,
Maybe I
that
don't
kind of makes it about me.
Yeah, maybe I don't mean feel it, but I'm more of mean it.
Well, it's different.
Yeah.
Feeling it and meaning it are different.
Yeah. Excuse me, I misspoke. It was more of a mean it kind of thing.
Yeah. So then let me ask you, I think we've kind of covered what a disciple would have meant in the first century, and kind of how that tied in both in the life of Jesus and some of how we see it evolve in the first century church. What does it mean like for us now in the 21st century living in, the U.S.?
I think a lot of it has to do with what we've said so far, was that it's a little bit different role for everyone. We have those that are the servants. We have those that are the witnesses. We have those that are the worshipers that may grow into even more. And that almost contradicts what I said a minute ago about the ultimate act of a disciple is worship. But what I mean by that is the worshiper who brings more worshipers. We have those that, God bless them, are the data entry people. I can't say enough about the people that are willing to go and do the data entry for us. They a lot of times they'll say, "Well, all I'm doing is entering stuff in," but you're enabling somebody else to go and do worship instead of data entry. Or excuse me, not do worship, but do ministry. And in that, it is a ministry in itself. Just like when the disciples in Acts rose up the deacons to enable them to go and do ministry as well. We have those that their gift is visitation. And they go and visit those that are sick. And it's not to say that you can't have people that do all of these things. The disciples did all of these things. So it really depends on where you're at and what your gifts are. And that's the beautiful thing about Jesus. He meets us where we're at.
So do we just find our niche and stay there?
No. No, that would mean that we never grew.
Oh, so what does that look like?
Well, being 5'6", I don't know a lot about growing.
Oh, you beat me to it.
I did. You were setting me up, and I knew it.
I was. Oh, well. But I don't know. There's a lot of talk about, building discipleship plans and wanting to see people grow in this way or that way. And I'm just curious, like, what that looks like. And for me, there's another kind of scripture or another kind of passage or story that stands out. And it's from the Old Testament. And it's David in this conversation he has with Saul right before he fights Goliath. So David fights Goliath. David is this kind of teenage shepherd boy, and the Israelite army doesn't want to fight him. No one from there will volunteer. And he shows up and he's like, well, I'll do it. So they're all feeling a little bit of like shame. And Saul, who is the king of Israel at the time, offers David his armor. And from all accounts, Saul's a big guy, and David was probably your size. So David kind of puts it on. He's like, I can just see him kind of stumbling around. He's like, I can't use this. This doesn't fit me. Let me, go fight him kind of with the stuff that I'm familiar with that fit me, the slingshot and without any armor that lets him be quicker. So we don't want to cram David's into Saul's armor. We don't want to force like disciples or force people to put on things that don't help or that don't fit their gifts and graces, right?
Right.
Because I dare say if David had gone out there in Saul's armor that was, 12 sizes too big and kind of stumbled around and fought, that story might have had a different ending. But at the same time, David would have looked different 5 or 10 years later and would have needed different armor or different weapons because he would have changed and evolved. So we don't want to push David's into Saul's armor, but we don't want to keep David's stuff. We don't want to force people to do or to put on things that don't work for them, that don't fit with their gifts and graces and talents. In this case, we don't want to physically make people wear clothes that are the wrong size because they'll just look silly and they'll stumble around and trip over their pants legs. But we also want to make room for the fact that people should grow over time. David physically got bigger, and as disciples, we should grow as well. So I'm wondering what that looks like for us. How do we both encourage and make space for people to grow, but don't force them into things that they're not built for or that don't fit?
I think Jesus gives us a fantastic example for this. In just collecting his 12 disciples, he watched them.
Uh-huh.
He listened to them. He knew Peter was going to grow into a good leader because Peter was the one that was always willing to speak up. There was 12 guys in the boat, and only Peter is willing to get out and try to walk on the water.
Sure.
And it's about relationships.
Uh-huh.
Disciple building or discipleship plans or whatever you want to call it don't work without relationship. And ideally, churches should be full of relationships. And not just casual relationships. They should be full of strong relationships of people that know each other and love each other, which is why small groups are so wonderful.
I guess this is my question. Small groups are wonderful. I've been a part of many of them. Small groups sometimes, though, they turn into like people doing life together, which has its benefits. But it seems to me that one of the core elements of a first century disciple is there was a leader kind of guiding and investing in them as they did life together. And there was someone showing them the next steps. Jesus was, he was like, watch me do this. All right, now you guys try to heal some people and I'll stand here and kind of watch you. And then eventually, I'll trust you to go off on your own in pairs. And then I'll step out of the picture completely and let you take over. I think we do a good job of getting people into groups. I don't think we do a good job of investing in intentionally preparing people
I think
for the next step.
what we don't do a good job at is investing in creating leaders that can do this. Because we'll put people in small groups and hope that they choose a leader from among themselves. And they may all be in the exact same place, and no one is prepared to show the way. And that's one of the I think it's one of the reasons why small groups, the way that John Wesley designed them, don't really exist very often in the modern United Methodist Church because of the lack of leader development. And that's on us as pastors.
Yeah.
Totally on us.
So would you say maybe the first step in, if we want to help people grow in their faith, is one of the first steps to find a way to build and train like leaders?
It's what Jesus did.
And the assumption is those leaders will bring others along behind them and others along behind them.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, you were talking about the way Jesus did this, and that Jesus, he healed some people, then sent the disciples out and watched them heal. You think there were some disciples that just weren't very good at healing? Like, you had one disciple that went to go heal the lame man, and instead, took care of irritable bowel syndrome instead. Just didn't get it, And Jesus, okay, this isn't your gift, but we'll find a place for you.
I have no idea. Yeah.
Because, that's what we actually do in building leaders, though, is we observe and we see, okay, you know what, maybe your gift is with the children, the fact that you're screaming at them and foaming at the mouth while working with the children, maybe that's not where you're gifted. Let's find a different place for you.
Let's find a different place, something different for you to do, huh?
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, there's some of that, I think. Why don't we do a better job of building leaders?
Some of it is the way that, and this is just an excuse, but you know what? Excuses are a great thing because they give us an excuse. It's the way our society is today. It's hard enough to get people there on Sunday. And now what we want to do is get, let's say, 12 select people there or be with them 3 or 4 more days a week. Because honestly, true leadership development isn't a once a week thing. It's a time-consuming investment. And time is the one thing that, oddly enough, we're in short supply of in our culture. We have all these time-saving devices that ultimately end up causing us to fill our time even more.
And I guess maybe this is something we could take and think about, and everyone that listens to this can take and think about as well. But what do we do with that?
I think we have to be more intentional. I didn't expect to come up with any solutions today.
Well, good, because I don't have any.
Yeah. If we were able to come up with these solutions in a 45-minute to an hour show, then we would be Bishop.
Super genius.
Yes, exactly.
I don't ever want to be a bishop, though.
Hey, they would let us have the hat. If we came up with this solution, they'd even give us the hat. They'd be like, okay, you have earned the mitre. And
no one wants the hat.
I want the hat.
Even bishops don't want the hat.
I want the hat, man. I want to sit in my office and wear the hat. That's my dream. That's my dream. Not to be a bishop, but to have the hat and just sit in my office all day wearing the hat.
Yeah. So it occurred to me, disciple making in the first century seemed to be a pretty slow process. Yeah. Jesus spent years with kind of different people preparing them.
3 to be precise. But he spent 3 years of being with him every day, 24/7.
Yeah. And I think it's still a slow process for us today. Like, some things can't be rushed. And if we're not going to be together 24/7, which I don't particularly want like 12 people to move into my house tomorrow, it's going to take longer. Huh?
You mean this wasn't an invitation for 12 people to move into your parsonage?
It was not.
Okay. Just
so we're clear. No one is invited over. No.
Man, that is very Jesus of you right there. No one's invited over. No one's invited in.
Ever. You're only... No.
So, no, I see where you're going, though. That it's... if we can't spend every waking minute with someone like Jesus did, it's an even slower process.
Yeah. And we're not Jesus.
Exactly.
There's that, too.
Yeah. I'm not sure I want people imitating me.
I think Paul kind of summed up, what a disciple means to us. He had that like, follow me as I follow Christ.
Right.
That's, you're not saying imitate me. You're like, imitate me as I'm trying to imitate, Christ.
Right.
Follow me as I'm following Christ.
Pay attention to those little bits I get right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the stuff I don't, you ignore, and you try to get those other bits right.
So it's slow and it's intentional.
Slow, it's intentional. It's imperfect.
Yeah.
Because we are imperfect. It's bit by bit, and sometimes it's like taking baby steps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's a lot to chew on, man.
But it's important.
Yes, it is. Very important stuff. Well, I think we have covered this as best as we're capable of covering it.
Which is sad for everyone.
Yes, it is. It is, especially for those that chose to listen to us.
No, I think the goal is not to solve the problems today, but maybe just bring some light and to bring some intentionality and progress, not perfection.
Progress, not perfection.
If we can be a little more intentional, a little more effort, and we can make progress in the right direction, even though we're never going to be perfect.
Right. Keep our eyes open for those that we see as potential disciples, or disciples in the definition that we used earlier. I guess I should say keep our eyes open for potential leaders.
Sure.
Yeah.
Care for your own soul. I mean, if you're saying follow me as I follow Christ, being a dedicated follower and caring for your own soul and growing in your own personal discipleship is necessary.
All right.
And important.
All right.
Yep.
So y'all keep this conversation going. What do you think a disciple is? What are the most important traits that we need to focus on? And how do we train up leaders? This isn't just a discussion between Jeremy and I. It should be a discussion with all Christians.
Yeah. It's important questions for all of us to consider because it's not getting any easier.
No.
And it seemed pretty hard when Jesus did it.
Exactly. And and he was God. So
yeah.
All right, man. Well, blessings to you and blessings to you all.
And to you, sir.